if you've received any lately, or if not, there will be some coming, I'm sure. Just for a means of identification, when I was a youth pastor at a large church in another state, I was also overseeing a district youth talent event. And, a lot of people take that very seriously. And I was in charge of the whole event. I wasn't judging the individual events. But one of the young men in our congregation finished second in the musical solo talent competition. And it seemed that the person who won had missed a technicality and therefore should have been disqualified. And when that young man in our church didn't win, and this information was found out, his father called me to let me know that all of this was my fault. And he said to me, "You are the worst youth pastor in history." And when you hear something like that, I don't know where your mind goes. Even while he continued to talk, I was thinking, does he mean this church? Or does he mean like all youth pastors in all of history, in every church, everywhere, ever in all of it? And about 2 weeks later, he apologized to me, kind of in a hallway with some other people around. And he said, this was his apology. Maybe you've received an apology like this. I'm sorry for what I said to you the other day. I meant it, but I'm sorry that I said it. So, if the next time you're heavily criticized, just remember your district superintendent is the worst youth pastor in all of church history.
Love that. I love the sort of taking away the apology from within the apology. That's really skillfully done. I'm sorry, I meant it, but I'm sorry. Well, you do get a lot of criticism. We're going to talk about that when we talk about resilience and how do we cope with that. Particularly in an environment that we're in now that is so polarized, and the vitriol with which people will speak to a pastor and treat a pastor is just beyond anything I've ever seen, at least in my lifetime, and it's abusive at times. And so I like to tell groups of pastors like you, I think you should get 1 day a month when you can say whatever you want to say to whoever you want to say it to with no consequences. Wouldn't that be awesome? So I want to show you a little video. We're going to talk about the need to cultivate emotional intelligence kinds of competencies to self-regulate. It takes an enormous amount of emotional self-regulation. I'll unpack what I mean by that to be a pastor. What would happen if you didn't self-regulate, maybe on a Sunday morning? Check this out.
From the book of Proverbs. If I may digress for a moment from my prepared message, I mean it when I say to you, you guys, sometimes you're bad. Don't be jerks. You're supposed to be good. I'm in my office every day, and somebody comes in, and they're like, hey, whoops. I'm like, don't! Dan, what is your deal? If anybody doesn't know, Dan is the worst. I took a vow to not say who was the worst, but it's Dan. You guys are making me look bad in front of God. What's that? Oh, look, it's Jesus. And he said, stop it! word of the Lord.
Isn't that great? The word of the Lord. I love how he
Stop
does
it!
that. I don't know many pastors that haven't at least fantasized about doing that from the pulpit and letting it fly. Now you don't do that, do you? And you don't do that for very important theological, pastoral reasons. There you go. Now that you know that's a possibility, you can let it fly. But the question for us when we talk about resilience is what do you then do with what you're carrying around as a result of all the interactions you have? I mean, church people can make you really angry. I don't know if anybody else has had that experience. Scripture never says don't be angry, by the way. It tells us how to behave when we're angry. Don't do violence out of your anger, for example. But just being angry, I would contend, is not wrong or sinful. It is a God-given emotion like our other emotions. Oops, I just stepped off the stage. That is there to listen to, understand, process. And we need to process these kinds of things. And so when we talk about resilience, it's about bouncing back. It's about recovering from adversity, going through difficulty. We talk about things like adaptability and growth. Psychological hardiness or grit might be the other term that you've heard. Just that capacity to withstand difficulty. You are a resilient group of people. How do I know that? Because you're in this room. And if you've been doing ministry for any length of time, you're naturally resilient, and you've figured out somehow to access that resilience enough to keep doing what you're doing. And so you're inherently resilient, and I want to highlight for you what you're already doing, and maybe suggest some things that you can continue to do to build on that. We asked in this research what helps you flourish, but also what hinders that flourishing. And there were many, many things that pastors said to us across hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of in-depth interviews, and these were the 4 most common themes that came up. This is pre-COVID, by the way, research. Post-COVID research, stay tuned. Research always lags behind real life, so I'll know soon what all this looks like during and after COVID. But these 4 themes: complaints from parishioners. Anybody resonate with that one at all? Nobody? Wow, I'm surprised. Yeah, some of you do. All of you do. Negative challenges from lay members, and this is referring to challenging your pastoral identity in totality, in sort of a global sense. Not just one thing that you did I disagree with, or one thing you said in a sermon, but you're a bad pastor overall. You're the worst pastor in history, youth pastor in history. I mean, it's a pretty big claim, you know? That's a global criticism, right? Not just I'm disappointed with this one thing that happened in my son's life, but you're the worst youth pastor in history. And what we find is that women in ministry leadership and pastors of color are much more often on the receiving end of those kinds of comments, more severely, more frequently, that are either veiled or very overt: racism, sexism, those kinds of things. And it just gets old to be on the receiving end of that, right? It erodes our sense of positive pastoral identity to be on the receiving end of that. Have you noticed people will say and do things to pastors they would not say and do to anybody else? Have you noticed this? Like people feel just permission. I was doing a workshop for a large church in Southern California, so I went to the service that morning, and the pastor preached this great sermon on conflict, on how to approach conflict in healthy ways, even within the church. It was a great sermon. And he told this story on himself. He said, a couple years ago, I just finished a sermon. This guy I never met before comes up to me, doesn't even introduce himself. He's not like, hi, how are you? My name is such and such. Thank you for your sermon or whatever. He just came up and said, my wife thinks you need to lose weight. First thing out of his mouth. And he said, you know, I could have been pastoral in that moment. I was tired. I I didn't filter myself, and I just said to him, well, tell your wife I think she needs a facelift. And he said, now, I've never seen his wife. I just wanted to give them a taste of their own medicine. So I'm not recommending doing that. It probably wasn't the appropriate response. But people will just say and do things, won't they, that they would not do to anybody else. Churches that demand the pastor conform to their expectations. Now, in my opinion, that's probably every church to some extent. But this is talking about when it's really excessive, when there's not sort of an appropriate deference to pastoral leadership in appropriate kinds of ways. When, pastor, we will tell you how to preach, what to preach on, how to lead, etc. What we found is the strongest predictor of flourishing in ministry is when there's a mutually supportive, respectful relationship between leadership and congregation. And I know that's a two-way street, but there are things we can do to help cultivate that and lean into that. And when that is the case, we learn to love one another with our strengths and our flaws and work through that. And we do this together, and that becomes a beautiful thing. Now, the question is, why do people treat pastors the way that they do? And the way that they treat pastors results in isolation, which is probably the number one occupational hazard for pastors. And it's kind of counterintuitive. It's sort of a water everywhere, not a drop to drink kind of thing, because you're around people all the time, aren't you? People is what you do. So how could you possibly be lonely, pastor? How could it feel isolating? Well, there's an isolation and loneliness to leadership inherently, first of all, but the way people relate to you, they relate more to your role than to who you actually are as a person or a leader. I'll give you something that's not in a slide, and this is also from Dr. Archart. It's called the 70-30 rule, 70-30 rule. At least 70% of the criticism you receive as a pastor, as a leader, probably has absolutely nothing to do with you. At least 70%, could be more. So only 30% of you is the worst youth pastor in history. No, I'm just kidding. Good. No. Now that has a couple of implications. That means that 70% of the compliments we receive probably have nothing to do with us either. It's about people's need to idealize you, put you on a pedestal, that sort of thing. And I'm sure you've experienced that, where someone's complimenting you, and we all need to feel affirmed, but then it starts to feel kind of excessive, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, I'm gifted, I've worked hard, I'm good, but I'm not that good. That's about their need to see me in a certain kind of way. And maybe 30-ish% of the feedback that we get, it's often unsolicited feedback and given, right after you just preach the sermon of your life and have a wonderful worship service, and somebody has the drive-by comment on their way out of the back door of the church. Horrible timing. You didn't ask for the feedback. But maybe 30% of that is somewhere in the neighborhood of our actual strengths and gifts, or our actual growing edges, blind spots that we all have because we're human. So it becomes difficult then to sort out the 70% that's not about you from the 30% that may be somewhat legitimate. How do you do that when most of the feedback you're getting from people is distorted? I was sharing with the group yesterday. I don't know did they have State Fair in Texas? I would imagine it's probably bigger and better than anybody else's State Fair. Yeah, the rodeo. Okay. So in Tennessee at the State Fair, they had an old school fun house. Anybody ever been in a fun house at the State Fair? And you walk into a fun house, and they're all the mirrors that are all different shapes of mirrors. And some of them make you look extremely tall and really thin. Some of them make you look really wide. They're distorted reflections. And being a ministry leader is like living in a fun house. Most of the reflections, the feedback you're getting from people is distorted. Now, what is that 70% that's not about you? I think most of it is what psychologists call psychological transference. Transferring thoughts and feelings, ways of doing relationship from a person's past, unmet needs that weren't there for them as children that should have been met by parents and caregivers, disappointments with God, disappointments with my spouse, disappointments with myself, unmet expectations. All of that gets projected onto your role. Just like the projector is projecting the slide onto the screen, your role is the screen. And people are projecting all kinds of stuff onto it. Does it ever feel like somebody's working through their issues on you? It's because they are. Now, people don't wake up on Sunday morning, typically, and think to themselves, I'm going to go work through all my stuff on my pastor this morning. Yay, here we go, It's often unconscious for people. Now, therapists, we're trained in what transference is, how to recognize it when it's happening in a therapy session or therapy relationship. We're even trained in how to elicit it on purpose, how to interpret it for people to help them grow. And when long-term therapy is kind of coming to an end is when people have largely worked through the transference. They've had a reparative experience in therapy, and you've helped them relate differently than their previous experience with caregivers or authority figures, that kind of thing. Pastors, however, often aren't even told this is a thing, and that you're flying blind in a sea of people's projections. They're projecting all kinds of stuff onto you all the time. Therapists, we get this nice life history, so we can even learn to predict the transference. Like I can tell by this family of origin experience, probably at this point in therapy, this person's going to have this kind of transference. And we have the nice 45-minute hour therapists do. I don't see clients ever anywhere except in my office for that 45 minutes. Doesn't work that way as a pastor, does it? You see people in every possible context you can imagine. Makes me think of the story you shared yesterday, which I won't have you share, but in the car, Ray, about the woman with the prosthetic leg. So just ask Ray about that story sometime. I'll just leave it at that. The situations pastors find themselves in, the boundaries aren't there like they are for other helping professions. And so it just evokes this business of transference. Let me give you an example of what this looks like. My grandfather was pastor of mostly small, I like to say clergy-killing Nazarene congregations in New England. His entire ministry is one of my heroes. And they lived in a suburb of Boston in the 50s, and just to tell you what this experience was like, they moved into the parsonage. It was an old drafty parsonage, physically connected to the church, so you could actually open a door in the living room and be on the platform in the sanctuary kind of situation. Major life in a glass house, right? But there wasn't adequate heat in the parsonage, and my dad's family moved there in like January in Boston. There's like feet of snow on the ground. It's below freezing, probably below zero at night. And so my grandfather went to the church board, he's only been there a month, and asked them to do something about the heat in the parsonage. And after an hour and a half debate in a board meeting, they voted it down. And that kind of told him what that experience was going to be like for the next however many years working with that particular church board. Not super supportive, right? But there was a gentleman from the church who came by on a regular basis. He would just show up at the parsonage about once a month. My dad remembers as a boy, my grandfather would open the door and he would just start to yell and scream at my grandfather. Just verbally rage on him. And he didn't physically attack him, but looked like maybe he was going to. Pretty intense kind of a deal. And he just did this from time to time. And my grandfather found a way not to respond in kind, which is often what part of us would like to do, right? He tried to put boundaries in place, and you can't talk to me that way, and please don't do this anymore. The guy kept doing it. Several years go by. My grandfather gets called to a new church, and they're literally pulling out of the driveway to drive to the new assignment, and who pulls up with his family to the parsonage to say goodbye? The same man. And he gets out of his car, runs over to my grandfather, throws his arms around him, and just starts to cry and weep. Oh, thank you, Pastor. Thank you so much for everything. We're going to miss you. Thank you so much. And my grandfather, who told me this story, he said, I didn't return the hug. I'm just standing there like this. Like, who are you, right? You're the same guy that's been verbally abusing me since I got here. And my dad and I got talking about this, and my dad has seen enough of this kind of thing happen to pastors and even in his own ministry career to realize that this, while hurtful, wasn't probably about his grandfather. This guy had grown up with a horrible childhood. Alcoholic father, raging alcoholic, physically abusive, verbally, emotionally abusive. This guy was the oldest sibling, so he took the brunt of the abuse to protect his mom and his siblings. He'd never processed that abuse history, that trauma. People didn't go to therapy back in those days, at least in New England, for that kind of thing. Who is this guy actually angry with? He's angry with his own father. Who did it come out on? The closest father figure, sort of wrapped up next to God. You have to be nice to me no matter how I treat you. Person who happened to be the convenient target. It all came out on the pastor. Transference. Most of the feedback that you get, both the criticism and the idealization, has to do with that kind of phenomenon. Now, why is that helpful? Is this making sense, by the way? Are you thinking about conversations you've had with people? And by the way, typically the more emotionally immature a person is, the more they're going to tend to do this kind of thing. We all probably do it to some extent without even realizing it, just to kind of categorize people and make sense of the world and stuff. But why is this helpful to know this? Well, it's helpful because then you can learn to depersonalize a lot of that and also learn to have boundaries with it. I do not think God expects pastors to just take abuse from people. I really don't. Now, you need to be pastoral in how you respond, but part of that can be confrontation, can it? Caring enough to confront, saying your behavior's out of bounds. We don't behave like that here. We can have healthy conflict, but you're not going to attack me or anybody else that way. That's not how we behave here. And help keep people in bounds, and if they won't agree to that, then you put boundaries in place, that sort of thing. But this is what can lead to burnout, is the chronic interpersonal stress. And this seems to have been ratcheted up exponentially during and after COVID and the political environment. Here we go into another presidential election cycle. Most pastors are now like, oh man, here we go again. You know, I can just hear it now. No matter what I do or don't do, say or don't say, somebody's upset about something. Can't win, right? I didn't preach enough Democratic or Republican agenda, or somebody read into it something I really wasn't saying, and they're upset. Can't win. And this is what can lead to an emotional exhaustion, along with all the other responsibilities that pastors have, which is a symptom of burnout. Burnout includes these kinds of things. Just feeling spent. Just got nothing left. I want to have something left. I know I should. I just don't have it in me. Physically, emotionally, mentally. And we find ourselves not being able to adapt as easily when we're in some phase of burnout. We can't roll with the punches, so to speak, as easily because we're depleted. And then we can even get to a point of cynicism or despondency. Why does it even matter? What's the point? Is this even making a difference? And that can be on Monday mornings when many a pastor has found themselves looking through job listings online. What else could I do? Some of you know Scott Daniels, who's now a general superintendent, who's a wonderful guy. And I remember him saying he and his wife realized early on that he could start looking for a different kind of job, but he really didn't have any other marketable skills. So he was kind of stuck with being in ministry. It's really funny. And all of us go through this kind of thing from time to time, especially when we've gone through a particularly demanding season. But when this becomes something that lingers, that deepens, that grows, and that's something for us to pay attention to. So this begs a couple of questions. What we know with some confidence now is that somewhere around 30% of pastors at any given moment are in moderate to severe burnout. About a third of us. But here's the tricky part. It's insidious. It sneaks up on us. Pastor after pastor after pastor after pastor has said to us one way or another in this research, I didn't see it coming. It blindsided me. It hit me out of nowhere. The truth is, it was building through that mild and moderate phase outside of our awareness. And then it hits a threshold of severity, and boom, we're aware of it all of a sudden. And by then, it can be costly in terms of emotional health, relationships, financially, vocationally. So I have two questions for you in light of that. Who in your life knows you well enough to recognize the early warning signs of burnout in you before you see them in yourself? Because that's how it works. There's something about it that hides itself from the pastor entering into burnout. We become myopic in a way that we just can't see it in ourselves. So we need other people in our lives who know us well, love us enough, and have permission to tell us when they're seeing those signs, so you can take action early before it progresses to that moderate and severe phase. Make sense? But then the other question is, how do we prevent it? Again, some Nazarene-specific statistics here. 41% reported frequent emotional exhaustion. 10%, this is, again, pre-COVID. I suspect this is higher now. The sample is fairly often or often considered leaving ministry within the last year. Do you all know that the average length of a ministerial career in the Church of the Nazarene now? 6 years? I think that's right. Used to be 9, it's a little shorter. That's not just in one church. That's like entire pastoral career before somebody says, I'm out, I'm doing something else. Right? Is that? That's right. That's exactly right. So if not, I'm not even at long enough to have enough positive experiences to develop that, then that's really challenging. It also, congregational studies folks tell us that it probably takes 7 to 10 years for a congregation to really get on board with a given pastor's leadership, for the system to shift. So, is that what? I'm sorry?
Is that a number that's based on people coming into ministry, or is that
Any church, any congregation that gets a new pastor, it just takes a long time to develop the trust and change the deep culture of the church.
with the 6 years?
Oh, that's just the average across all Nazarene pastors, the length of career.
Take people who've been in the ministry for 50 years, show them that number as well?
Yes. Yeah. 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 Again, it doesn't have to be that way, right? That's why we're talking about this. You can see some of the other things here. The one at the bottom here is interesting to me, and I don't quite know what to make of this other than a quote I'll share with you from a man named Pete Scazzaro, some of you may be familiar with. But 47% of our sample, almost half, said they try to make sense of the situation and decide what to do without relying on God. Some of you know the name Pete Scazzaro. He wrote a couple wonderful books. One's called Emotionally Healthy Leadership. I highly recommend to you. He's a pastor from New York City. Emotionally Healthy Church, Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, really good stuff. We had him speak at an event in Southern California with about 600-700 pastors in the room, and he did an amazing job talking about rhythms and contemplative disciplines and principles of emotional healthy leadership, and really good stuff, a lot of similar stuff to what I'm sharing with you. And we did a Q&A time with him, and this pastor raised his hand and said, well, Pete, that's great for you. You're Pete Scazzaro. You got a publisher. You got staff. You know, you can take a Sabbath. I'm a bivocational pastor. It's just me. I don't even have a paid, secretary. I don't have time for all this stuff. And Pete, who's an Italian New Yorker, he literally has relatives that are in the mafia, he says, so he would tell his church board, I know a guy, so you better be nice to me. But he's pretty direct. and it's congruent for him. You kind of know it's coming from a place of love, but he said to this pastor in front of 700 of his colleagues, I think your problem is you're a functional atheist. Got awfully quiet in the room. He said, by that I mean you have a whole systematic theology in your head, but how you're actually functioning in life and ministry is as if God wasn't part of the equation. Because if you really trusted God, you could take a break and trust that God's going to continue to be at work in your church, in your community, in you, even while you're resting. So you're a functional atheist. That's your problem. Sort of no further questions, Your Honor, at that point. Yes?
I heard Eugene Peterson say to a group of pastors one time about this issue. And he said, if you're unwilling to take a Sabbath, you're spiritually arrogant.
Wow. Wow, that's good. That's good. We talked about sleep last session. However long you slept last night, and it may not have been 7 to 9 hours of deep sleep, and we need that long, by the way, because we need to go through a certain number of 90-minute sleep cycles where we go into rapid eye movement sleep, which is the deep sleep. If you ever see somebody asleep and their eyes are going back and forth under their eyelids, that's when all the magic happens in sleep in terms of restorative brain stuff and all kinds of great things. And we need to go through that cycle enough times to really be replenished and renewed. Who kept the universe functioning last night? Right? You did? Okay, wow. Impressive. Who kept your heart beating? Your lungs breathing? There's something even theologically important about sleep that we can reflect on. We're going to trust God with whatever happens while we're checked out. Similar kind of idea here in terms of pacing ourselves. So what prevents burnout? Well, what we're finding, yes?
He can do it better without us than we can do it better without him.
Amen. That'll preach. Yeah. That God can do it better without us than we can do it better without him. Yeah. Isn't that true? God can do it with or without us. God chooses to invite us into it by the mercy of God. And so what we're learning about burnout, preventing it, and recovering from it has to do with what we call self-regulatory capacities. So look at your neighbor and say, how are your self-regulatory capacities today? Yeah. Now the video we saw, not a lot of self-regulation there going on in that particular sermon, right? What do these skills look like? Well, the first one is self-awareness. The socio-pastor I mentioned that I worked for once, you ever seen anybody in a position of power in a faith community who has almost no self-awareness? How does that go? Doesn't really go very well, does it? Just not connecting the dots between how I behave, how I come across, how that impacts people, how my leadership choices are influencing the organization and the system. Just oblivious, clueless. Can be very destructive. So self-awareness is, what am I doing, thinking, and feeling? How am I behaving? What emotions am I experiencing? What's my thought life like? And how is that impacting me and other people? Just self-aware. Now, what the research tells us is that we all start at maybe a different point with self-awareness, but we can all grow in self-awareness, and we do that through living life in community. I can't cultivate self-awareness by myself, right? I'm a clinical psychologist, have an MDiv, way too many degrees, and I had this epiphany into myself recently, and I was telling my wife about it. Like, this was like, I just had this insight into myself. And I shared it with her, and she kind of grinned and said, oh yeah, I recognize that, like on our fourth date or something, Like, why can't I see it? I'm the one with the clinical psych degree, and I can't see it in myself, because that's not how it works. In fact, sometimes all of the knowledge that we have can get in the way. we really are reliant on community to develop and cultivate self-awareness. So self-reflection is then, why am I doing, thinking, and feeling what I'm doing, thinking, and feeling? Where's this coming from? What's getting stirred up in me? Could be the nature of the situation. Could be the transference, somebody else's stuff that's not about me. But it also could be that something in my own story is getting tapped into here. Was talking with a pastor recently, Methodist pastor, who's now kind of high up in the Methodist hierarchy, and he said, man, I realized years later there was a woman in one of my churches that I just could not stand. You know, I tried to be, you know, you love people even if you don't like them very much sometimes. That I tried to be, I didn't have her in any committees. I just could barely tolerate being in her presence. He said, I realized years later, she reminds me of my sister, from whom our family is estranged, who's been extremely toxic and difficult, and he said she just happened to be around the same age, looked kind of similar, and I wasn't aware of it. And I wish I could go back now, because now I can remind myself that's not your sister. Now she's still difficult, but it's not your sister, and I can then respond differently as opposed to knee-jerk reacting out of my own stuff in some way that I wasn't aware of. That's self-reflection. And then the self-control is the responding piece. It's the fruit of the Spirit we're created for. Amen? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. That we actually can respond rather than react. But this takes emotional energy. It takes practice. This is very similar to what's called emotional intelligence kinds of competencies, if you're familiar with that phrase. Years ago, there was a psychologist who came up with this theory of multiple intelligences. We talk about IQ, right? And that's important, and you have to have a significant IQ, in my opinion, to do pastoral ministry because it's complex. But what researchers are finding is that there's other forms of intelligence. There's a kinesthetic intelligence. So professional athletes who just know how to move their bodies in space and the mechanics of a great baseball swing, for example, they're just gifted in that kind of intelligence. There's an artistic one. My brother Craig was really a child prodigy in music. I remember him being 5, 6 years old. He could hear a song on TV one time and walk over and play it on the piano. And I was in Nashville recently, and he was at his kitchen table writing a full orchestration out of his head with no piano. He can just hear it, first, second, third violin, flute, cello, oboe, French horn, and just write the score down. I'm like, who are you? I grew up with you, but, you know, you can't learn that. That's just there or it's not kind of a thing, you know. There's an artistic kind of intelligence, and then there's this thing we call emotional intelligence, which most of you have more of than the average person because you're in the work that you're in. But we can all grow in this, is what the research is very clearly showing us. We can develop further capacity for self-awareness, for empathy, being able to read people well, respond to people well, being able to be in the midst of other people's struggles and anxiety and difficulty and caring about it, but also remaining somewhat differentiated from it, where we don't have to take it all on and carry it for people. Those kinds of things, we can develop those skills, and we're finding that's really central. I want to invite you to take out a piece of paper that you can write on. So we're going to do an exercise here in a minute. Lots of things we could talk about in this way. I want to focus on grief for just a little bit, what I call pastor grief. This has always been true, but especially through and after COVID, it just seems like there are a lot of things that are losses we need to name and help ourselves to mourn. Statistics say 30% of churches will close within 5 years after COVID, and most churches will experience about a 30% decline after COVID in regular attendance. that's just an average. But there are things that have been lost. And I would suggest to you, grief and loss are central to pastoral ministry. You're immersed in other people's loss frequently, and there are forms of ambiguous loss that pastors experience uniquely. So, for example, what about when somebody leaves the church? It's a loss. Now, I had one pastor say to me, well, it depends on who it is that's leaving. Sometimes it's like you've been praying and fasting for years and it's in like an exorcism. Finally, they're gone. But most of the time, there's a form of loss and grief there that is even tied to a sense of rejection in some way. And how could it not be? And what do you do with that? What about when a staff member or a key lay leader makes a really poor, sinful choice in their life? There's an affair. Blows apart a marriage. There are kids involved. The whole congregation can feel that when it's a significant family. And you uniquely grieve that, don't you? You carry existential and emotional burdens for people that, frankly, their physician doesn't carry. Nobody else in their life carries those the way that the heart of a shepherd carries those things. And what we know about grief and loss is we have to name a loss in order to grieve it. If it remains unnamed, it'll remain unresolved in terms of grief. And so I want to encourage you to think about naming losses. So this is the chart I want to invite you to make on a piece of paper. 4 columns, 3 rows. Across the top, the right 3 columns put real, threatened, or imagined losses. Why real, threatened, and imagined? Because threatened and imagined losses evoke a grief response the same way that an actual loss can do. So, for example, if any of you have been in a really bad car accident, I hope that's not the case, but if you have, you've been kind of through a near miss experience. People will often have a big emotional reaction afterward because they almost lost their life. And it just evokes this grief response. So threatened losses or imagined losses, as well as real, actual, concrete losses. And then you have concrete and abstract, which is just what it sounds like. So you can have concrete, real losses, concrete, threatened, concrete, imagined, abstract, real, abstract, threatened, abstract, imagined. And I've given some examples here of the kinds of things that I hear pastors talking about or that I've experienced. So, for example, in real concrete relationships, when people leave the church, that's a concrete loss. When someone dies that's beloved, it's a concrete loss. When giving is down, there is financial loss. That's a concrete loss. Make sense? More abstract losses that are real would be things like self-esteem. We know from research that pastors have a lower self-esteem at the end of their career typically than they did at the beginning of their career. Why? Because of that 70%, you just keep getting beat up by church people. And there's a loss, there's a sadness we can have for ourselves appropriately. Ministry dreams. I was sharing with the group yesterday. I was standing with our Dean of Theology in the hallway, and this person was kind of looking around, looked like he was looking for something. So we said, "Can we help you?" And young man, he said, "Oh yeah, God called me to be a mega church pastor, so I'm here to sign up for that." And no, I mean, that's my reaction too. Clinically, I start going all kinds of places as a psychologist, right? What are we dealing with here? And just without batting an eye, the dean said, we don't really train those here, so you'll have to find somewhere else that does that. It was a great response. 90% of the churches in America are under 100 people, right? So the likelihood that this guy's going to be a mega church pastor is slim to begin with, and the fact that he's so confident of that is a little troubling. But what about when those ministry dreams don't happen at a certain phase in life? There's loss. What about when you lose trust in your own denomination? I've been there. Can I just get really honest? when the sense of safety, psychological and relational safety and trust is compromised, we grieve that. We lament that, right? Threatened concrete losses, job security, what is that for anybody anymore, I guess, in some ways, but when our job is threatened in some way. Imagine concrete loss. Has this really made any impact? Hard to know. How do I even measure that? You get the idea of these categories of losses. So what I want to invite you to do is take about 15 or so minutes and fill in some of these blanks. You may want to do more of this later. What are some of the losses that you're carrying? That maybe you're in the process of grieving and mourning, or you really need to pay more attention to starting that. We'll talk about what are the tips for grieving well after we have you do this for a bit. But write down some of those losses and just share a couple of those with your table, and we'll come back together in 15 or so minutes to talk about, okay, what do we do with all of this? What are the practical steps we can take to help ourselves with emotional intelligence, self-regulation, preventing burnout, promoting resilience and flourishing? Make sense? Go for it.